Thank you, Richard, for the introduction. Good morning, colleagues. My job is to excite you and also entertain you. I have enough slides for at least 3 people, never mind 2. Most of them are photographs and diagrams, historical pieces. I mean, I'm going to give a historic polemic overview of economic and regional development, embedded in which are some of the historical challenges that the inquiry that Lord Bob is involved in. Some of this you might not agree with. I hope to stimulate debate around this, but I think we are shaped, the opportunities for the future are shaped by the legacies of the past. I'm an academic, but I'm a political realist at the same time, so I work in different worlds. My title, if you want to know what I did on this slide, which is interesting, I put every single paper that I'd ever written into a Wordle. It's the second slide. The first one I left my name on, so the main common thing was Jones in the middle. Of course, I can't work on Jones, so I took it out and redid it. As you see, my historical work is based on the interplay between economic and political geography, on the interface between state, economy and governance. And of course this historic moment in devolution is an opportunity to look at some of this work over time. So I'm fortunate to be here today and fortunate to be working on these things that will actually come real. My link to the inquiry that Lord Bob will talk about, I think the 2 things that I have to say that will stimulate debate throughout the day really is governance arrangements for decentralisation. I think some of the work that I'll focus on can talk to that in terms of what you can learn from the past and also the future and the way next about governance relationships, how to do governance, but also the thorny issue, what it means, the relationship between devolved territories, UK, PLC and Whitehall in terms of the effect of different bits going in different directions. If you remember the Monty Python sketch, 100 metres, for those with no sense of direction, if you look at it on YouTube, the idea of the splintering of the UK, I think, are important things I think Lord Bob will pick up later. My title, if you're thinking what is the impedimenta state, it's an argument I've been developing for the last 20 years. Things that impede, things that block, things that get in the way. I think there's a lot of legacy and a lot of baggage that's accumulated from the past here in terms of the impedimenta. This is a slide that explains this. I actually got this from the idea of the state having a finger in every pie in terms of the relationship of not letting go. I mean, this is Alistair Darling over the banking crisis. Of course, this was a previous slide in terms of the Business Link initiative, if you remember that from the 1990s. This is a hilarious slide from 1996. Department for cleaning up after Mr Heseltine's initiatives. The idea that we're sweeping up from the lessons and the mistakes previously is something I think there are lessons to be learned from this. This is, of course, a subnational review, experts in the room. I had this diagram drawn by a cartoonist for a book that I never wrote because I ran out of time. But this is departments for coordinating government departments. Apologies to local government and civil servants people in the room in terms of you falling over each other. I think there's a lot to learn from the past in terms of the future. And this diagram here is pertinent here in terms of where we are. There is a legacy of initiative overkill of things in terms of the field of local economic growth. If you've not seen this, this is the National Audit Office report, which is one of the most dynamite pieces of evidence in terms of us reinventing the wheel, or as Jeff Morgan said, institutional musical chairs when the RDAs were abolished, or what you would keep called institutional corpuses. There's a psychology in the English state system in terms of pathology of compulsive reorganisation. This is an opportunity, of course, to challenge this in terms of the all change, devolution, revolution, as we heard from the Chancellor in October of last year. So this is an opportunist moment to take stock of the future from the legacies of the past. Here, explain the funny cartoons here. I'm working on with David Beale. David, put your hand up in the room. We're working on a case study of Sheffield, Manchester, Cardiff and Swansea on city region building. So we're tracking a lot of the things that are going on the ground. This is Sir Keith Burnett, my Vice Chancellor. This will be unique in the world, a truly new industrial revolution. So there are new unique opportunities. It did make me laugh when he said, this is the place that looks like Thunderbirds. He was talking about the AMRC site in Sheffield, Rotherham, in terms of the old Eurogreen coking plant that will be transformed. If you don't know Tracy Island from the Thunderbirds, this is a cartoon from Anthea Turner of Blue Peter. If you squint your eyes slightly, you can see the similarity between Tracy Island and Thunderbirds and the AMRC in Rotherham here. Again, I'm making fun of this, but I think there's some interesting narratives being put out about this being a unique opportunity through innovation districts, the work of Bruce Katz and others, to focus on the basis of a second industrial revolution. The argument that I want to put to you in the remaining time that I've got left is it the case that we've perhaps lost sight about what this is about? I think there are some deep historical challenges that we need to address going forward. So any future acts and moments of decentralisation and devolution certainly has to address the things that I'll throw up from the past. Some of this I think we can see in the current devolution of settlements that need to be addressed. Some of these are elements that Lord Bod will focus on. You know, I'm involved in a project with David, and we're not sure who is actually involved in this, who benefits, issues of accountability, opportunities, you know, where is the future direction of the devolution movement. There's certainly this historical pendulum of things swinging from local to local or regional that needs to be addressed over time. I think there's consensus, if you look at the evidence on devolution, that things are mixed, things aren't working, and there is questions about where next. So it's the lessons that you can learn from the past. But I want to conclude my presentation with an optimistic look forward about how we make this new spatial economy work, and this will provide a segue to the inquiry that Lord Bob will talk about. This is predicated on, I think, challenge number one, the issues of spatial disparities. These slides you've probably seen over time. What's interesting, if you look at the annual growth rate of GVA across the north and the south in terms of which cities are actually leading in the north and south, it's oversimplistic to say it's just London. If you look at the growing cities here that are leading the way in terms of gross value added, Milton Keynes, Telford, you know, Warrington in the case, so you know, in the Devo Manc agenda, look at where the growth is actually coming from in terms of core periphery. This is really interesting to focus on in terms of where this is coming from. A lot of this is driven around the connection to finance capital in London, but there's obviously something else going on. This is a spatial disparity. If you look at these patterns over time in terms of the laggard and the growth areas, you can spot patterns that go back to the 1930s that actually focus on the evidence of the Barlow Commission that gave birth, of course, to regional policy. You look at quotes from Osborne, you can pull out similar quotes from the 1930s, although the patterns are slightly different. There's a deeply historical legacy of north-south that needs to be addressed in any serious act of devolution going forward. I think the second challenge is the one I've highlighted, is governance beyond institutional upheaval, governance beyond the idea of moving from one thing to another. This is, of course, a framework. Policymakers in the room here, you're not faced with a problem, you construct a solution to the problem. As a geographer, what I find absolutely fascinating over the years is looking at the relationship between decentralisation and devolution and the geographical anchor points. If you look at what is dominant over time, how you can move from forms of localism to forms of regionalism to forms of localism to forms of regionalism. It bounces through geographical scales over time, and that, of course, creates complicated, complex, what academics call multi-level governance. And it's unravelling those tensions around multi-level governance that I think is important to focus on today. Who does what at which spatial scale are questions certainly in my mind. What I'm going to do now briefly is spend 5 minutes tracking the shift from localism to regionalism to localism and the issues that throws up, because I think you need to take stock of this to look at where we go next and some of the contradictions and tensions currently post-2010 in decentralisation and devolution are based on the journey and the legacies from the past. New localism, of course, early 1980s, based firstly on clarifying the role in 1989 of local government, but also always trying to find a framework for engaging the private sector in terms of a historical journey, which you see in Michael Heseltine's writing, the search for fixes around chambers of commerce. This is the Foster report from 1985, trying to create an institutional fix to bring in the private sector. Of course, we went to the US to look at solutions from the US, and I know Brandon Evans is in the room, wrote a great book on the training market, on the Training Enterprise Council movement. I did my PhD on this in the early 1990s. Interestingly, and I've done discourse analysis on the quotes when LEPS came in, there's a 90% overlap between the call to arms that came to LEPS to the previous Training Enterprise Council movement of business leaders working in partnership with local government, change agents. This, interestingly, according to Bob Reid, was a second industrial revolution. So the question I've got is, how many times can you have a second industrial revolution? Should it be a third industrial revolution? Interesting slide here. Spotters will see Lord Smith, when Lord Smith was Peter Smith, the leader of Wigan Council. This is the Wigan PLC movement, a unique movement in the 1990s, a partnership between Metrotech, as it was then, and local government. The issue then was, of course, the issues of who was involved. And some of the same tensions I think we still see here, of the role of labour movements, the role of the trade unions, the role of funding regimes, who's involved in the governance of economic development, the role of trying to engage employers. So one of the tensions I see in the current devolved model it still is the historic role and intervention and role of the private sector, certainly in terms of skills agenda, although I don't acknowledge great work going in on the apprenticeship movement. The issues of accountability on spend, but also these contradictions, I think, were formed in the 1990s, in the late 1980s, 1990s, that then worked their way through a history of kind of 15 to 20 years. And these are some of the things that are left. I think are some of the key challenges that decentralisation and devolution faces today. Issues of accountability, issues of the role of the private sector here, the issues of complicated fiscal federalism has been caught in Gordian knots over funding regimes, having to do something for something else, and being caught in a set of contradictions. And the real challenge for me is addressing governance failure in terms of responding to congestion on the ground, and I'll say something more about this in the current era. Of course, these contradictions, rather than being resolved, were then displaced in the 1990s in the RDA model, the Regional Development Agency model, and the great piece in the New Statesman of the grow bag, the RDA punching their weight in their global marketplace under Richard Cabourn and under John Prescott, those contradictions of localism being placed into another project of region building in the Labour administration. It's an original cartoon that I got from the Evening Standard, whereby welfare to work was drawn in because the conveyor belt of change in economic development was moving so fast in terms of the regeneration game here, and I think that's what's happened. Issues from then, I still think are still on the ground. There's multiple agencies involved in the same area, but who is actually control? So one of the agendas I think we need to sort out is who's involved in and controls certain agendas, albeit working in partnership here in the Southwest. John Prescott, in his very, very happy days, and this is one of the doors that I want to open up with Matthew Flinders later, was of course behind the Constitutional Convention movement. And one of the things I think we could talk about in the current devolved era is having more forms of region building, democracy, assemblies, people involvement. Interesting work was done, of course, in the 1990s around constitutional conventions. I did a project on the Southwest looking at region building, and you'll laugh at this, you know, the role of this chap here called Gerard Chunky Dunster in terms of the Southwest, but it was an idea from the RDAs to develop a regional identity. Are we seeing this in LEPS, or is it just an economic growth model? Of course, the North East vote, the no vote, put a nail in the coffin of a lot of this, so it's bringing back some of those things here. I did a project then on Cornwall and looked at Mebium Cornell in terms of the Cornish nationalists, you know, getting involved in region building. And also, you'll laugh, but it was serious. You know, my friend Alexander Finn, the Marquis of Bath, the Wessex regionalists at the same time in terms of region building. Some of these more crazy cultural movements are quite pertinent to now. Of course, then we had the Northern Way. The Northern Way then gave birth to the core city movement and city regions. And interestingly, this is where the congestion comes through of what academics talk about when they talk about meta-governance, the coordination of coordination. This is pre-devolution. The things that devolution needs to respond to is all those coordinating relationships. Local government officials in the room, you remember, but local strategic partnerships, strategic area reviews, local area agreements, multi-area agreements, and the Total Place Initiative in the dying days of the Labour government. Attempts to coordinate that impedimentious state and the mess created by the past in terms of coordination of coordination. This is a bit of a mess when you look at this. Of course, in comes Eric Pickles and new localism in terms of addressing the contradictions here. You see the rise of the city region movement. LEPS and enterprise zones come round again in terms of creating an opportunity. Lord Heseltine comes back in, a real shift away from central government and quangos to local communities. I think there's a lot of open agendas here for involving local communities in a variety of ways. It's one of my favourite cartoons of all time, the Francis Maud Bonfire of the Quangos or Quagmire of the Bongos, in terms of this being, rather this is a new form of accountability or kind of lessons from the past into the things that we can learn here. And you know, one of the things I'm always focused in as a geographer in terms of those spatial disparities, and you can clearly see this, and we'll focus this on later. If you look at the city deals, who got what, is this unevenness, is this transparent? Are some regions more equal than others in terms of growth dynamics? What exactly is going on in terms of how these are calculated in terms of the negotiations on the ground? Northern Powerhouse, as Richard says, you know, comes in here. The rise of Jim O'Neill and the RSA Growth Commission here is, you know, the emphasis of where the opportunities for this in the future are. The interesting thing here, and Richard talked about this in relation to the lunch, is the relationship between decentralisation, city region building, and being caught up in a complex geographical politics of austerity. Yeah, if you look at the Sheffield devolution deal, the 900 million over 30 years, it probably plugs half the gap of one council's cuts over the same corresponding era. I've not done the exact figure, but there's some serious issues about being caught in a game of, you know, this politics of austerity in terms of what we get involved in, the relationship between different levels of financial responsibility therein. So based on this historic legacy, I think this is the troubles of LEPS, and I'll pan back out of here. The things I think that are on the ground that are pertinent to Lord Bob's inquiry are, you know, the precise functions of LEPS and combined authority, the issues of accountability, actually being accountable to everyone and no one. If you look at some of the parliamentary select committees on accountability in terms of the early LEP model, issue for me, the third issue is what kind of economic growth have we got here, economic growth for whom and for where, issues of what deal-making public policy actually means for accountability in terms of who's involved in here and how these things get debated, real issues around risk and austerity, issues, serious issues, and I picked up on some conversations with some people that arrived early about territorial correspondence and non-correspondence. Does boundary coterminosity actually mean anything to you on the ground? The fact that LEP boundaries are or aren't coterminous, the fact that the Sheffield City region interfaces with Leeds, LEPS to the south and D2M to to the south and Leeds City region to the north. The fact that Department for Work and Pension work programme delivery boundaries don't map onto LEP boundaries. And certainly in terms of if you we have further devolved localisation of skills, post-work programme, do boundary geographies make a difference? Are they actually important or are they a distraction on the ground? There's a lot of debate around this and issues, of course, of uneven development. I'm going to fly through this because these are the bigger issues that I think ought to focus on. Some of the bigger issues that I think are related to Lord Bob's inquiry, and things that make me nervous about the North, are the North in relation to the welfare bill and work bill, the possible geographical impacts of universal credit when it comes along, looking at some of the work done by Sheffield Hallam, Steve Fothergill and Christina Beattie, look at the geography of welfare spend and welfare cuts applied to the North. Secondly, the uneven geographical impacts of local government cuts in terms of what it means, to reduce the budgets going forward. Thirdly, where the ownership of the apprenticeship levy falls in terms of turnover organisations of 3 million, whether this is a disproportionate impact on the North. Something that comes up in the recent Pensions Select Committee, the predictions going forward around the localisation of business rates in the context of not of counter-cyclical grant regimes. Very, very interesting. It's going to be fascinating as a geographer, looking at the fiscal federalist geographies going forward, the localisation of large parts. The opportunities and risks afforded therein of the health and skills agenda that's coming from Devo Mank into pilots around city region building around skills and welfare, and the extent to which DWP work programme plus post-work programme will actually devolve anything rather than pilots, and the risks therein of this. I think some interesting questions. UUK's emphasis on Innovate UK or grants to loans will hit certain areas, and also in terms of spending review, whether the actual spend on transport will address some of the historic unevennesses in the National Infrastructure Plan 2014. The concluding point, I think, which is one to look at, is the limits to this agglomeration economic model. If you look at some of the labour market data, there's some interesting things that Craig and Sperry colleagues have talked about on what's going in and going on in the economy on the ground. The opportunities therein around engaging civil society in holistic city region building. We're not hearing that much about identity politics, citizenship, new ways of involving citizens in democracy. This is heavily dominated, probably necessary for now, a heavily dominated economic growth debate because of where we are, politically. One of my favourite cartoons about what can and can't be done under the mayor here. John Mothersole, Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council, did say in the Sheffield Star on the 3rd of October, when asked who would be the forerunner, he said it was Buzz Lightyear. From Toy Story here. It's a flippant aside point. If I was mayor, this is what I'd be charged with looking for, and this is the real issues, I think, in terms of the on the ground, in terms of focusing on the economy, in terms of the North. There are serious issues I think in northern regions and the Sheffield City region therein, about the jobs gap, the extent to which this can be plugged by the work programme, how this interfaces, of course, geographically with the training and skills agenda, then in turn, in terms of labour market geographies and issues of low pay. I think this is one of the ways that kind of innovation districts work in, the kind of Bruce Katz literature that are informing UK policymakers. And that's the challenge really for combined and competitive city region building. Let me conclude with a slide in terms of making the spatial economy work rather than depress you, or to provide a segue to what Lord Bob will come on and talk about in terms of the agenda. I think the things that I want to focus on, that are, I think, the serious questions going forward, one is having an effective and imaginative form of governance that's accountable in a variety of ways, but also that which is coordinated historically and vertically. And I've talked about this elsewhere in the notion of combinatorial urbanism, the connections historically, vertically, between forms of governance. So people are clear who is doing what and where and how. Secondly, the fact that spatial economic, the balancing, the spatial economic balancing is actually a distinctive policy objective rather than just pure rhetoric. So there is a serious attempt to decentralise some of the activities in London and the South East. I was having a chat to somebody earlier about the opportunities afforded by public sector local banking regimes that map onto some of the fiscal federalist German models that start to challenge some of the fundamental fiscal geographies embedded in London and the South East. Issue number 3, I think, is to have a relative form of fiscal autonomy, and I'm drawn here by the fantastic local welfare safety net that the Work and Pensions Select Committee published earlier in the month, where there's some serious geographical issues raised around localisation, when they argue for flexibility balanced by projections, reasonable minimum for everyone in need no matter where they live. And there's some great stuff in that report, interestingly, on the localisation of business rates that's in that select committee, when that select committee looked to be about work and pensions and welfare. And also challenge to economic development professionals working in the room, and this is the link I think that Lord Bob wants to raise, the economic relationship between devolved city regions and the broader notion of the UK, in terms of having a smart agglomeration. Everywhere can't be the same. So the issue is what is done at national level in a national interest in a post-devolved UK system, or what is done locally. One of the fears that I've got is every city region tries to copy each other, and the scale of investment that's needed in science policy to create jobs in innovation districts means you'll be thrown into a regime of competition and you won't maximise what is deemed to be in the national interest. Of course, the national interest becomes interested in a devolved multinational state system, and you're seeing this in terms of the arguments around what future for the UK PLC. I think I'll stop there. Richard, hopefully I'll throw some agendas forward that will stimulate questions throughout the day.